What if I told you that one empire would rise from a small frontier principality on the edge of the Byzantine world to dominate 3 continents and shape the course of European, Middle Eastern, and African history for over 600 years? What if I told you that the Ottoman Empire's rulers combined military genius, religious authority, and political cunning in ways that allowed a dynasty to survive centuries of wars, rebellions, and changing powers? And what if I told you that the world we know today, from borders to culture, from trade to religion, was deeply influenced by the legacy of this empire even long after its collapse? To understand the Ottoman Empire, we must go back to the late 13th century in the lands of Anatolia, where the seeds of one of history's greatest powers were quietly being sown. The Ottoman Empire began with a small Turkic principality in northwest Anatolia. The founder, Osman I, gave his name to the dynasty. His family and followers were part of a larger pattern of migrating Turkic peoples who had settled in Anatolia after the decline of the Seljuk Sultanate. Osman was not the first or only tribal leader, but he was extraordinary. He combined skill in warfare with strategic marriages and alliances. He leveraged his followers' loyalty and his own charisma to slowly expand his territory. In these early decades, the Ottomans were just one of many small principalities, often fighting neighbors and vying for land that once belonged to the crumbling Byzantine Empire. Yet Osman's successors would take advantage of the instability, turning what was once a marginal frontier principality into the foundation of an empire. Orhan, Osman's son, expanded the Ottoman territory southward and westward, capturing key towns and fortresses. But the Ottomans' rise was not just about brute force. They were masters of diplomacy, forming alliances and vassal states, and incorporating conquered peoples into their administrative system. The Ottomans understood the importance of legitimacy. They married into local noble families, adopted the symbols of power from previous rulers, and framed themselves as both warriors and protectors of Islam. The capture of Bursa in 1326 marked a turning point. It became the first major Ottoman capital. The city allowed the dynasty to consolidate power, collect taxes, and develop an administrative system that would become a hallmark of Ottoman governance. Over the next century, the Ottomans expanded into Europe, taking advantage of internal divisions among Balkan states. They built a powerful military, including elite units such as the Janissaries, who were trained, loyal, and highly disciplined. Under Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottomans achieved their greatest early triumph, the capture of Constantinople in 1453. The fall of the Byzantine capital was not only a military victory, it was a psychological shock to Europe. Constantinople became Istanbul, the new Ottoman capital. It was transformed into a cosmopolitan center of commerce, culture, and religion, a city where East met West and where the empire would project its power for centuries. The early Ottomans understood that conquest alone was insufficient to maintain an empire. They developed a system of governance that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Provincial governors collected taxes, enforced law, and maintained order, while the Sultan held ultimate power. The empire used a legal system that combined Islamic law Sharia with local customs. The Ottomans were also patrons of architecture, art, and learning. They built mosques, palaces, schools, and hospitals, demonstrating their authority and creating loyalty among their subjects. Religion was central, but it was administered pragmatically. Non-Muslims were allowed to maintain their faiths under the millet system, giving communities a degree of autonomy. Military might was the backbone of the empire. The Ottomans invested in artillery, naval forces, and disciplined infantry. The Janissaries, originally Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system and converted to Islam, became elite troops loyal directly to the Sultan. The Ottomans mastered both siege warfare and mobility. They combined gunpowder artillery with traditional cavalry, adapting continuously to the changing nature of warfare in Europe and Asia. This adaptability allowed the empire to expand steadily from the 14th to the 17th century, reaching the heart of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had moved far beyond its humble beginnings in northwest Anatolia. What had started as a small frontier principality under Osman, I was now a sprawling power spanning 3 continents. The empire's success rested on a combination of military skill, administrative brilliance, and cultural sophistication. Its expansion was methodical, deliberate, and often strategic rather than purely violent. It was not enough for the Ottomans to conquer land. They needed to hold it, govern it effectively, and integrate it into a functioning empire. Few sultans epitomized the Ottoman Golden Age more than Suleiman I, known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. Ascending the throne in 1520, Suleiman presided over the empire at its peak, both territorially and culturally. Under his rule, the Ottoman domain stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to Baghdad in the east, and from the northern reaches of the Black Sea to the Red Sea and North Africa. Major cities, Constantinople, Cairo, Baghdad, and Belgrade, formed the backbone of a vast imperial network. Suleiman's genius lay not only in conquest, but in consolidation. Military campaigns were matched by reforms in law, taxation, and governance. He commissioned a comprehensive legal code, canon, that regulated both civil and criminal law, complementing Islamic Sharia law. This dual system allowed the empire to administer millions of people from diverse religions, ethnicities, and social classes. The Ottoman administrative system was highly organized and hierarchical. Provinces were governed by appointed officials known as beylabis or pashas, who oversaw taxation, law enforcement, and military levies. The empire's bureaucracy was sophisticated, capable of balancing central control with local autonomy. The millet system allowed religious minorities, including Christians and Jews, to govern themselves in matters of personal law, worship, and education. This pragmatic approach reduced internal unrest and ensured loyalty to the Sultan, while simultaneously reinforcing the empire's image as a stable, orderly state. Central to this administration was the Sultan's court in Istanbul. The palace, Topkapi, was not only a seat of political power, but also a symbol of Ottoman wealth, cultural refinement, and divine authority. The Sultan's presence radiated both fear and reverence, reminding subjects of the central power and unity of the empire. At the heart of the empire's expansion was a formidable military machine. The Janissaries, originally recruited through the Devshirme system, were the backbone of Ottoman infantry. They were trained from childhood, rigorously disciplined, and directly loyal to the Sultan rather than local rulers. The Ottoman army combined mobility with firepower. Cavalry units, artillery, and infantry worked in coordination, allowing for effective sieges, rapid offensives, and defensive flexibility. Naval power was equally important. Under admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean, controlling trade routes and projecting power across North Africa. This allowed the empire to challenge European maritime powers and secure the flow of wealth from trade and tribute. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman was not just a military and political powerhouse, it was a cultural center. Architecture, literature, calligraphy, and art flourished. Suleiman himself was a poet, writing under the pseudonym Muhibi. He patronized scholars, architects, and artists, creating masterpieces that combined Islamic traditions with local styles. Mehmed, the empire's chief architect, designed mosques, bridges, and palaces that remain architectural icons to this day. His mosques, with soaring domes and intricate ornamentation, reflected the harmony, balance, and grandeur of the empire itself. In addition, Istanbul became a hub of learning. Libraries, madrasas, and observatories attracted scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond. The city was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and ideas, a symbol of the empire's diversity and sophistication. The Ottomans controlled key trade routes linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their cities were filled with bazaars, caravanserais, and ports that facilitated commerce in spices, silk, coffee, and precious metals. Taxation was carefully regulated. Local producers and merchants were encouraged to contribute to the economy, while trade was protected by the state. Wealth flowed into the treasury, funding both military campaigns and monumental architecture. European powers, while competing with the Ottomans, relied on Ottoman-controlled trade routes. Venice, Genoa, and later Portugal and Spain had to negotiate carefully to access Eastern markets. This gave the Ottomans leverage in both diplomacy and war. Islam was central to Ottoman identity, but the empire was also pragmatic in its religious policies. Sunni Islam formed the state religion, with the sultan serving as caliph, but religious tolerance was essential for governing diverse populations. Christians, Jews, and other minorities were incorporated through the millet system, allowing the empire to maintain social cohesion. Religious scholars advised the sultan on law and governance, while Sufi orders contributed to cultural life and education. Religion reinforced authority, but it was balanced with a practical understanding that loyalty and stability depended on inclusivity. Despite its strength, the empire faced persistent challenges. European powers, wary of Ottoman expansion, mounted military campaigns to contain them. The Siege of Vienna in 1529, though unsuccessful, marked the empire's reach into Central Europe. The Ottomans also contended with rival powers in Persia, North Africa, and the Red Sea. Maintaining such a vast empire required constant vigilance, resource allocation, and skilled diplomacy. Internally, managing a multi-ethnic empire required both coercion and incentive. Revolts, power struggles, and succession disputes were frequent, but the centralized bureaucracy and military often quelled unrest before it could threaten stability. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire had achieved what few states in history had: stability, territorial expansion, economic dominance, military superiority, and cultural influence, all under a single dynasty. Istanbul had become the jewel of the empire, a city of mosques, palaces, markets, and scholars. Its influence reached from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, and from the coast of North Africa to the banks of the Euphrates. The empire's golden age demonstrated that conquest alone was insufficient for lasting power. Administration, culture, economics, and diplomacy were just as important as the sword. Yet even at this height, subtle cracks were appearing. Expansion could not continue indefinitely. Generations of sultans following Suleiman lacked his energy or vision. Europe was changing, adopting new technologies, navies, and political systems that would eventually challenge Ottoman supremacy. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached a turning point. What had once been an unstoppable force stretching across Europe, Asia, and Africa began showing signs of vulnerability. Military victories became harder to achieve. Administrative efficiency started to falter, and the once unshakable aura of Ottoman power began to wane in the eyes of Europe and the world. Suleiman the Magnificent had set a high standard: territorial expansion, cultural flourishing, and administrative sophistication. However, the sultans who followed him struggled to maintain his level of control and vision. The empire's central bureaucracy grew more rigid over time. The elite janissaries, once fiercely loyal and disciplined, became politically entrenched. Their influence over succession and government policy increased, often undermining the authority of the sultan himself. Corruption began to creep into the administrative system. Tax collection became inconsistent, provincial governors acted with increasing autonomy, and internal power struggles became more frequent. The empire remained vast, but its internal cohesion was weakening. While the Ottoman army had once dominated the battlefield with cavalry and disciplined infantry, Europe was catching up and surpassing it. European powers, especially Austria, Russia, and France, adopted new military technologies and organizational strategies. Firearms, cannons, and artillery became more advanced. naval power shifted to European states, particularly after the rise of the British and Dutch navies. The Ottoman navy, which had once controlled the Mediterranean under admirals like Barbarossa, struggled to maintain supremacy. By the late 17th century, the balance of naval power had shifted decisively toward European fleets. The Battle of Vienna in 1683 marked a critical moment. Ottoman forces, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, attempted to capture Vienna, but were decisively defeated by a coalition of European armies. This battle symbolized the limits of Ottoman expansion into Europe. It was not just a military setback, it was a psychological blow. The aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated for centuries, was broken. Following Vienna, the Ottomans lost territory steadily. Treaties such as the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the empire to cede large portions of Hungary and the Balkans to European powers. The empire, once a major threat to Central Europe, became increasingly defensive. Losses in Europe were compounded by internal economic challenges. Trade routes shifted as European maritime powers opened new passages to Asia and the Americas. The empire, reliant on overland routes, began to see a decline in revenue. Inflation and mismanagement exacerbated the situation. Provincial governors often acted independently, collecting taxes for personal gain rather than the state. The central treasury struggled to fund the military adequately, undermining the empire's ability to defend its borders. Reforms were attempted, but progress was slow. Attempts to modernize the army, improve taxation, and reorganize administration met resistance from entrenched elites. Despite military and economic challenges, the Ottoman Empire remained a cultural powerhouse. Istanbul continued to attract scholars, artists, and architects. Mosques, palaces, and public works were built or restored, maintaining the aesthetic and spiritual identity of the empire. Ottoman literature, poetry, and calligraphy continued to flourish. Sufi orders preserved spiritual and social cohesion in communities. While the empire was declining politically, its cultural influence remained significant. The arts provided a sense of continuity, reminding both citizens and foreigners of the empire's grandeur, even as borders contracted and power waned. By the 18th century, European influence had grown significantly. The Ottoman Empire faced pressure from Russia in the north, Austria in the west, and Britain and France economically. Internal dissent and nationalist movements began emerging in the Balkans and Anatolia. Sultans recognized the need for reform. Efforts such as the Nizam-i-Sedid New Order under Sultan Selim III attempted to modernize the military along European lines. Western-style uniforms, training methods, and weaponry were introduced. Yet reform was often resisted by the Janissaries and conservative elites. These groups saw modernization as a threat to their privileges and influence. Rebellions, palace coups, and assassinations became increasingly frequent. The empire's political structure, once highly centralized and efficient, became increasingly fragile. Leadership struggles weakened cohesion, and corruption limited the effectiveness of reforms. As the 19th century progressed, nationalism began to reshape the Ottoman world. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Armenians sought independence or autonomy, inspired by the ideas of self-determination spreading through Europe. Simultaneously, European powers sought to exploit Ottoman weakness for their own benefit. Britain, France, and Russia frequently intervened diplomatically and militarily. Wars such as the Crimean War, 1853–1856, illustrated the empire's dependence on European alliances to maintain territorial integrity. Economic penetration by Europeans increased. Capitulations, trade privileges granted to European states undermined Ottoman sovereignty. Local economies became increasingly dependent on European goods, and the empire's revenue from trade declined. By the late 19th century, the empire was often referred to as the sick man of Europe. Yet even in decline, it retained remarkable resilience. Sultans like Abdulhamid II attempted to centralize authority, strengthen the military, and modernize infrastructure. Railways, telegraphs, and schools were built. The empire began to slowly industrialize in key areas, and Istanbul remained a cosmopolitan hub of commerce, learning, and culture. However, these efforts were insufficient to reverse the structural problems caused by centuries of military overextension, administrative inefficiency, and external pressure. The empire's future would increasingly depend on political maneuvering, diplomacy, and attempts to balance modernization with traditional authority. Legacy of strength and stability. Despite its political and military decline, the Ottoman Empire maintained a remarkable legacy of governance, culture, and religious coexistence. Its administrative systems, legal frameworks, and cultural achievements influenced modern nation-states in the Middle East and the Balkans. Even as territories were lost and sovereignty weakened, the Ottoman identity remained a unifying force for millions of people across the empire's former lands. The empire's decline was gradual, but its impact on world history was profound, shaping trade, diplomacy, law, art, and religion in ways that still resonate today. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had survived for over 600 years, an extraordinary feat for any state. Yet it had become increasingly fragile, a shadow of its former glory. Internal divisions, nationalist movements, economic dependency on Europe, and military stagnation had left the empire vulnerable. The once mighty state that had dominated 3 continents now struggled to maintain even its core territories. The stage was set for an irreversible transformation, one that would end the empire and give birth to a modern nation-state. World War I and the final struggle. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, allying with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The decision was driven by both strategic necessity and the hope of regaining lost territories. The war brought devastating consequences. Ottoman forces fought on multiple fronts in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Dardanelles. Supply shortages, disease, and poor coordination undermined the military. The Gallipoli campaign became a legendary episode. Though the Ottomans successfully defended the Dardanelles, it came at enormous cost. The empire was stretched beyond its capacity, both economically and militarily. By the war's end in 1918, the empire was exhausted. Allied forces occupied key cities, and Ottoman sovereignty had all but evaporated. The once formidable empire was now a defeated, fragmented state. The Armistice and Treaties. The Armistice of Mudros in 1918 formally ended Ottoman participation in the war. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, Izmir, and other strategic regions. The Treaty of Sevres in 1920 aimed to dismantle the Ottoman state completely, dividing its territories among European powers and creating mandates in the Middle East. For the people of Anatolia, these terms were unacceptable. The loss of land and the potential for foreign control ignited a nationalist movement that would shape the region for decades to come. The rise of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. From the ashes of defeat emerged Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, a military officer and visionary leader. He recognized that the Ottoman system, dynastic rule, religious authority, and multi-ethnic empire was no longer viable in the modern world. Atatürk led the Turkish War of Independence, defeating occupying Allied forces and establishing a sovereign state in Anatolia. By 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed, and the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. Atatürk's reforms were radical. The Caliphate was dissolved, Islamic law was replaced with secular codes, and modern institutions were established. The empire that had lasted 6 centuries was replaced with a nation-state built on nationalism, secularism, and modernization. The end of an era. The fall of the Ottoman Empire marked the end of one of history's longest-lasting, and most influential dynasties. What had begun as a small principality on the edge of Byzantium had transformed into a global power. It had left an indelible mark on Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Its legal systems, architecture, cultural achievements, and trade networks continued to influence societies long after its dissolution. Yet the empire's collapse also illustrated the limits of centralized, dynastic rule in a rapidly modernizing world. Political rigidity, military stagnation, and economic dependency made the Ottoman system unsustainable in the face of modern nation-states and industrialized powers. The legacy in modern borders and culture. The Ottoman Empire's borders had shaped the modern Middle East and Balkans. Countries like Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula were directly affected by the empire's administration, ethnic settlements, and trade routes. Cultural legacies endured as well. Ottoman cuisine, music, literature, architecture, and religious practices continue to influence life in Turkey and former Ottoman territories. Landmarks like the Blue Mosque, Topkapi Palace, and Suleimani Mosque remain enduring symbols of Ottoman artistry and ambition. A complex and enduring history. Historians often debate the Ottoman Empire's legacy. Was it a decadent, declining state in its later centuries, or a masterful system that preserved stability and diversity for centuries longer than almost any other empire? The answer is complex. Both are true. The empire's decline was real and inevitable, yet for centuries it governed millions across diverse regions, balancing conquest with administration, warfare with diplomacy, and religion with tolerance. Its survival for more than 6 centuries was a testament to adaptability, vision, and the power of institutions, even when later sultans could not fully sustain them. Why the Ottoman Empire still matters. The Ottoman Empire endures in memory, in scholarship, and in culture. It reminds the world that empires are not defined solely by conquest or wealth, but by governance, culture, and the ability to integrate diverse peoples. Its rise demonstrates how small beginnings, visionary leadership, and strategic thinking can produce global influence. Its decline shows the dangers of stagnation and rigidity in a changing world. Even today, the empire's history informs international relations, political debates, and cultural identities across Eurasia and the Middle East. Its story continues to captivate historians, filmmakers, and scholars because it is a story of ambition, power, culture, and transformation. Final thought. From Osman I's small principality to Suleiman's golden age, through centuries of conquest and administration, and finally to dissolution and rebirth as modern Turkey, the Ottoman Empire left a legacy unmatched in scope and complexity. It was an empire that shaped continents, influenced religions, and left marks on countless societies. And even though it no longer exists as a political entity, its spirit of ambition, administration, and cultural achievement remains alive in the lands it once ruled. The Ottoman Empire was, in every sense, one of history's most remarkable empires, an enduring testament to the possibilities and limits of human power.